Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. In this episode, I want to have a one-sided argument with a meme that has shown up a couple of times on Facebook. Now, this may seem like a silly reason to sit alone in a room and talk for a good bit of time, but I feel like it really illustrates a place where we may not be consciously aware of how much joy and ease and trust and sense of well-being we might be leaking by having this mindset. And I would argue that one of the practices that is really important for having the most ability to thrive, given the complexities of modern life. I like modern life a lot, but it throws us some curveballs that our ancestors didn't deal with. And so we're needing to adapt and find approaches that are ideally life-affirming and set us up for great soul satisfaction as well as quality of life. And part of what happens in a culture that has just all this weird things defining what's important and what we care about, specifically capitalism, Hollywood. I'm not against those things, but they are driven by what people will pay money for, and they drive people paying money. And so if you look at the amount of money that is spent in the beauty industry, for example, and I'm all for women feeling beautiful and good about their appearance and enjoying themselves, but there probably are things on our radar as women that our ancestors never would have wondered about, and for whoever we're trying to appear attractive to, they may not even be noticing. One of the pieces of wisdom I really liked was the notion that men tend to scan for beauty rather than flaws, but women have come up with this sort of self-objectifying, self-regulating approach that has been absorbed somewhat through osmosis to be really self-regulating, to scan for flaws, to try to correct and hide them. And it's worth considering the financial impact when you start adding up all the things that are spent on beauty products that, instead of being like, oh wow, I really love this, end up remaining in the drawer, and how much more money would be available for retirement accounts, for example. So there are a lot of ramifications to the stories that we have in our head, and I would argue that it's important to know how to weed the garden of some things that we absorb by osmosis that are pretty toxic, that just the nature of being out in culture, the ads we have, the assumptions that are made, the things on social media, there are a lot of frameworks that can be really problematic. You know, we get a lot of racist messages where no one's meaning for that to happen. Sometimes they are, but mostly they're not. And it's really important to make sure that we're cleaning those out of our mind. Women's value being associated with their weight is a really important one. And this isn't someone, sitting in a room plotting the downfall of anyone. It's the messages that we absorb kind of from all around us. And so I would argue that the sanest approach to this being true is to recognize when we have a crazy thought, like actually notice, like, oh, wow, that's nuts. I know at an earlier time in my life when I was going through a fair bit of romantic turmoil, I was having relationships that consistently did not go the way I hoped in the way that would have worked for me, and they came to their ends and their demises, and there was a lot of emotionality in the aftermath of the disappointed dreams and hopes, and it's just flat up painful when you have this emotional intimacy and connection and that goes away for whatever reason, whether the other person is participating in a way that's a deal breaker or whether they choose to step away from the relationship. It's just a thing that we go through that has some grief attached to it. But I remember those being times when I most acutely felt like I should lose some weight. And the crazy thing is that fairly early in my dating journey, I identified that, as a woman, I was going to get a lot of messages about my weight, and being the data-based engineering inclined individual that I am, I also kind of looked around at the data, which told me that there were men who were incredibly drawn to my body and were sexually objectifying it, and there were men who didn't think I was particularly attractive, and everything in between. And I mentally ran the numbers and figured out that I could have, sex every day for the rest of my life if I was willing to be more extroverted and less picky with someone who thought my body was just absolutely fantastic from his point of view, exactly as it was. Now, there are a lot of reasons that wasn't the lifestyle series of choices I made. I have a feeling sometimes like women who are more promiscuous should be given fruit baskets and thanked for their service. I say this as someone who's dealt with a lot of sexual intrusion and men trying to meet their sexual needs with my body. And I think that there's something really beautiful about the women who have a more dynamic participation that authentically works for them. So none of this is about, sex being bad, but all of that is to say, at these moments when I was going through a breakup, I had already pre-screened. I dated some guys who thought I was really super cool, but were lamentably frank about how I wasn't their type. And I dated men who thought I was absolutely stunning the way I was. And I'm like, well, given all of the biological stuff that's in my body about the importance of being attractive to a man, it would probably be a lot kinder to consider it a deal breaker if a guy thought my body needed some sort of improvement plan. The guys that I was breaking up with and that I was sad about that, there's absolutely no time where me being thinner would have made an appreciable difference in the relationship outcome. That was not the problem. That was not why we were parting ways. And yet, in the wave of all that emotionality and in the wave of things not working out and in the wave of my wanting him to have, behaved differently, this was the crazy thing that the brain of mine threw up on the screen of my head. And having spent a lot of time talking to other women, I don't think I'm alone in that. It might not be weight, although even women who are at an absolutely healthy weight, that thought can end up showing up. But there's a lot of just crazy ideas about our value being correlated to our appearance. And there's reality to it. There absolutely are places and situations where other people may have a reaction to us based on something about how we look or our age or our ethnicity or all of those kind of things. But my hope with this is to support us in having an internal landscape where we stand aligned with ourselves exactly as we are, that those toxic thoughts not be something that we allow to take root in our mind. I have heard the wisdom expressed that, we really don't have much control over what comes into our mind, but we absolutely can do something about what we allow to stay in our mind. And one of the things that is really helpful if your brain's getting loud about some of these weird cultural messages, if you calm the fight or flight, if you do some self-nurturing, get the Calm app on your phone and use it, take a day of the Danish concept of hyggen where you're making everything really cozy, bring down your stress levels, and the loudness and the teeth of these ideas are going to be, really, really eased up. And it's just really useful to notice when we're thinking something cuckoo and have a way of not believing everything we think. If you want a more focused way, if you're like, wow, I have said thousands upon thousands of times to myself this thing that I objectively know isn't true, fire ceremony is a great choice. You can do some fire ceremony and clear it. And one of the things that's interesting is even when people do achieve the effect, it can make them happier. If someone's really committed to looking different in some way and goes through plastic surgery, they might be glad they did it. They might be glad that there's the, change. But a lot of times they'll be really transparent that there was something else that they'd never worried about before that now became the focus because of the sort of habit grooves in the mind. So kind of a long intro to say, basically, I think it's really important to our mental and spiritual and emotional health, which then has a knock-on effect for our physical health, that we tend the garden of our mind and that we have a regular practice of pulling the weeds, of noticing if something, really has shame teeth in it. And Brene Brown's work, for example, is a really great way to reckon with that, to breathe through it, to shine some light on it, to take the teeth out of it. So I'm not saying this is super simple, and a lot of times when we have these thoughts that don't feel particularly good, we tend to avoid them. And I think that's where something structured like therapy, or the clients who work one-on-one with me regularly, where they're creating a space to proactively look at where they're leaking energy through thoughts and pain, is a really kind of a useful way to work with this. But regardless, I think it's important to be aware. And so this meme that I've seen from multiple people that I respect popped up it says something along the lines of, 20 years from now, you'll so wish that you had, everything that you have now. And I really get the underlying positive intent of that, which is to say, to some degree, a lot of us, not everyone, but a lot of us are wrestling with first world problems. Meaning that, we still have secure access to food and shelter, and things are generally working out. And sure, there's some situations at the level of fact where we have a boss that's not working out, or we're going through a divorce, or there's, a health issue, or perhaps none of those things are going on, and we still, are just kind of wrestling with the world. There's a lot of stress. And the truth of the biological design of our brain, if not provided with adult supervision, is a tendency to ruminate, to worry about the future, to, be upset about the past. And there's some really good biological reasons our brain tries to do that. And unfortunately, we just have kind of a lifestyle where we have a lot more opportunity for our brain to kind of go in circles and get on the treadmill about those kind of things. And it's a legitimate issue. And it's also true that one of the remedies is, if you write down some things you're grateful for, that helps on a biological and physiological level. It can actually help for quite a long time. So a gratitude journal or counting our blessings is great. I'm also not a fan of shaming ourselves by silver lining legitimately hard situations. I'm a fan of the both and, where you lost your job at a toxic employer and it was still an ego blow and really scary, and you're needing to abruptly confront all the things that you hadn't resolved on your own in your own timing that kept you in a not so ideal situation, and you get to explore all your fears about the subsequent job market. And even if a year from now you're in a way better job, it doesn't take away from the pain and intensity of that experience, even if in retrospect you're like, this was really happening for me. This really helped me out. So a lot of our society, under the guise of, an effort to feel better, and I'm all for feeling better, but it can end up silver lining really painful things and denying the opportunity for the authentic, proportional emotion for the situation to move through and be experienced. And there's a whole lot of stuff that, goes sideways when you don't process your emotion. Emotional numbing, very, very bad news. So even though I feel like all the people sharing this meme and whoever composed it are making an effort to have us kind of stop and see the things that are valuable in our lives, I really struggle with the message that is the story that, this is the best time of your life. I remember that story being told when I was in high school. These are the best years of your life. And, 13-year-old Katie, I think the first time I heard it, I was like getting ready to go into high school, so I might have only been 12, but said BS in her little head. I didn't say it out loud. I was very shy and, took authority figures seriously, but I absolutely had the conviction that high school was not going to be the peak time of my life. And in fact, you couldn't pay me to go back to high school. I the puberty was hard, and all of the heightened emotions and the intensity and the social awkwardness and feeling like embarrassment was the end of the world and having to sit in that hard desk for so many hours a day and so much less choice. I've curated a life at 49 where I really get to write my own ticket and have it all my way in a lot of different ways. Even sitting down to record this podcast, my desk chair is super squeaky, so I moved it aside, but I have this really nice cushy pillow that I put on top of the folding chair that I use to avoid putting squeaking on the soundtrack of my podcast. So there's just so much opportunity to have freedom and choice. And even comparing, my mid-30s to now, I'm really glad to be the age that I am. And I think it's hard that the combination of our human biology and the stories that get told in culture can give us a fear of the future that might turn out to be absolutely not grounded. I imagine that there are a lot of adults that if they could go back and say something, to their younger selves, so people in retirement age would want to go back and say, it's all going to work out. Like, just don't worry so much. It's going to be fine. And there are pros and cons. I grew up with parents who really, really worried about money. My mom really wanted to get to a place where her stomach didn't hurt when she paid the bills. And my parents were both incredibly frugal and thoughtful. There were no, wild spending for anything. They were just, trying really hard to make a single family income work so mom could be home with the kids and we could have our little hobby farm. And it was a complicated juggling act. And now they're at a time in their life where they went to their financial planner and he said, you're on really good track for, having enough money for the rest of your life. You could even step up your lifestyle a little bit if you wanted to. And there's a peace and an ease that I see in my mother that just wasn't there when I was growing up. She was just wound a lot tighter. And I love that for her. And she would be the first one to tell you that she loves being in her 70s so much more than any other time in her life. And I get that not everybody ages that way, for sure. There are, people who end up with, a lot of struggle in their older years. And that's, hard and scary. And it's easy if you're a person with a lot of empathy and psychic ability to imagine yourself in the situation of people who are in circumstances that you imagine you would find really difficult. I do think it's interesting that our brains tend to misrepresent how unmitigatedly awful things might be. It's a conversation for another time, but it's interesting that some of the things we think would be terrible and how upset we think we would be, it's actually a lower number. But staying on the subject of what our stories are about aging, we have a culture that really loves youth, and it makes it hard because I love fiction books. And at the same time, if the character that they're representing as being in their 20s doesn't have the maturity and self-talk and sophistication of someone in their 40s, I kind of want to throw the book across the room and not finish it. And so we have these really weird heightened expectations of the grace and the maturity of the very young people that we are in some ways putting in a really high status. And back in the day with tribal society, I believe that there was a lot of just not taking the younger generation all that seriously, and a lot of respect for the elders. A lot of the power in the decision making was with the community elders that were ideally making holistic decisions for the whole tribe. And so, while I think it's worthwhile to savor the journey of where we are in life and to recognize really cool gifts that happen and to have active practices that keep us from leaking our energy with rumination. It's just really easy to do if you don't provide your brain with adult supervision and interventions and training. That's what it can default to, and that will leak your energy and leave you feeling not very happy, even when things are really okay at the level of circumstance. So it doesn't mean that you need to ignore depression if you're, not in financial struggle. I don't want to paint that picture at all. But I do want to recognize that this comparison of like it's all downhill from here that started getting told to us when we were like 12 years old. Like, how mental is it that there were adults that were telling, preteens and people just starting their teens at the height of puberty that this was as good as it was ever going to get? Like, that's absolutely mental to me. And yet I heard it from a number of adults, and I heard it parroted by, the children that had listened to those adults. And it's not necessarily something that we have no control over. There are certain things we don't have a lot of control over, how we age. Lifestyle has an absolutely huge impact. So getting present with how do you wrangle yourself to do enough to set yourself up to age well, I think is a really worthwhile problem to solve in middle age. I'm certainly looking at my exercise from the point of view not of any cosmetic goals, but just I want to do enough. I'm not trying to do perfect. I'm not trying to do unrealistic, but just enough that I'm setting up future Katie to be able-bodied as she gets older. And of course, there are factors I can't control, but statistics and all of the medical information tell me that's super helpful. And so I'm skewing probability in my favor in a good way. But even more than that, even fast forwarding and imagining being elderly and perhaps dealing with diminished mobility and some of the challenges of aging. I remember getting my first VR headset a couple of years ago and just being in awe of what the experience was, of what this unlocked, and knowing it was the baby version of the technology, so it was only going to unfold from there, and how cool it would be to be able to like walk through a museum on the other side of the world, even if my mobility wasn't what I wanted it to be. And I certainly do, again, exercise to support mobility, but just what technology opens up, what medical advances open up. There's every opportunity where there could be cool, unexpected gifts in the future. Similarly, I'm trying to do enough saving for retirement. I don't want to swing the pendulum, really far where I don't have quality of life now in the interest of the future, but I do want to, set myself up well for that. And I think that it's worth looking at. And an older friend of mine, kind of was reflecting on what we're up to at different decades in our lives. And the notion that these kind of middle years are a time where we work in a more focused, efficient way in order to set up the latter period of our life where we have earned all the money that we need to earn. So what I need now is a very good model. And if you aren't achieving some of these things, if you are struggling with them, it's really good to, get your brilliant problem-solving brain in a focused, organized way on asking those questions. There are articles and books and financial planners and free resources. There's so much to teach us how to work with money in a really sane and balanced way that isn't standard issue. And yet, because we deal with money so much, we kind of feel like we should know it. It took me a while to learn how to manage money as an entrepreneur because I have all this rise and fall, and then I'd have the car insurance or some big bill that would be really impactful, and I made a spreadsheet with all of those expenses that are once or twice a year that are high ticket items, and then I put aside each month the money that's going to cover those things, so my tax deposits, but also my car insurance and renter's insurance and a number of other things. But more than anything, as someone who's really committed to a personal growth and healing path, and if you're still listening to me babble at this point in the podcast, you are too. the percentage of people that listen to podcasts is not nearly as large a percentage as it seems like, it could be. And so there is a little bit of a rareness of people who this is how they spend their leisure time, even if they're washing dishes while I babble in the background. But all things being equal, I think it's fair to say that those of us who are actively engaged with the question of how do I have emotional and psychological and spiritual health and well-being, and are curious about possibilities and mindsets, can really trust that future us is going to have a lot more resources in that regard than present us. If we're steadily putting in new ideas, new mindsets, new learnings, we're in the research and development, we try the Calm app, that didn't work as well, we commit to a morning walk, we do morning pages, we write a gratitude journal. We don't do all of those at once, we just move around. Sometimes we cycle around practices because we get bored with one, or it doesn't have the juice as when we started, or we try something else, or we cultivate friendships with people that mirror who we want to be in the world, that bring out the best in us. There are so many approaches, but there's an element where I would argue that the people who want to have freedom from suffering and are willing to put effort into that, and those who are, again, actually listening to a podcast on the subject, whatever else you're doing, you're moving in the direction of future you being happier and saner. And the truth is, there's a lot of evidence that we don't end up being wired to be happy. We're wired for survival and procreation. And then we have these souls that come into bodies. And sure, I've absolutely met souls that just seem to have a happy disposition. And yay for them. That's fantastic. It seems like a wonderful attribute when you default to contentment and good-naturedness and pleasure with the world. And a lot of us, that's not the default setting. And so we're learning how to curate our days and our time and our opportunities in a way that produces that outcome, in a way that produces well-being and contentment and efficiently pulls those weeds in the garden of our mind that will have us distort reality and lie to ourselves about what the future will bring in ways that are really unrealistic. And you watch news stories, and there are all kinds of narratives about how the planet might come to an end. And I choose to look at the data in a wider sense, and I know this can be an unpopular or opinion that people disagree with, and I have another podcast on, authentic reasons to believe that the world isn't coming to an end. But there's a lot of evidence of us moving toward more kindness and sanity and playing well together. And I still think we have a long way to go to a really sustainable relationship with the planet, with each other. We're not done yet. There's a lot that is in play and very dynamic in the world, and a lot of old souls incarnated to be in the game of moving humanity to the next place, as well as having our own explorations. So I think that everything is right and good with that. And I would just like you to notice where you may be by osmosis absorbing the story that youth is innately better than age, that somehow being older is going to be this awful thing. And certainly there are people in their 80s who have a very unhappy relationship with their age. And there are people in their 80s who are like, this is the best decade of my life. I am thriving. I love, what this unlocks. And sure, there's some ways my body's a little crunchier than when I was younger, and I don't love that. But overall, this is a really rich, creative, amazing, cool time where I'm not losing all of this energy. I don't have to show up for a job. I don't have to worry about things that just obsessed me at a younger age. And so I'd love for us all to cultivate something that feels authentic. Like, think about the story and give your mind the essay assignment of coming up with reasons why you might be a lot happier when you're 80 than you are now, that you might look back at present you with compassion. I I have so much compassion for 7-year-old Katie and 14-year-old Katie and 22-year-old Katie and 30-year-old Katie. I look back on these moments where I was so earnestly trying to make my way through the world, and I just didn't have all the pieces. I had so much social awkwardness and unmanaged energetic sensitivity and, longing to be seen, but also shyness. It was really complicated and loud inside my head. And my ways of participating with other people didn't have a lot of success and sustainability. And because I was on a, emotional growth path, and again, I think that that's what's important. Those of us who are choosing to spend our money, our time, our attention, not exclusively, it doesn't have to be the only thing we get up to. If you're, if you're in a hole, if, you're really not well at the level of mental health, for sure, it is a very important project to work on. So I'm all for, we may need to put in a lot of time and energy and focus if, something is not at a baseline okay enough level. But assuming that we're at an okay enough level and we just want to live a really good life that keeps getting better, the investments that we make in podcasts and inspiring information and tools and approaches to life and the research and development where we can find and dial in our secret sauce really set future us up to be really rocking it and really in a good place. And I think that consciously bringing this story to the surface that somehow, it's all downhill from here, and I work with a lot of people and I hear about a lot of childhoods, and there's some people who just have the story that their childhood was really, really good and happy and wonderful. And then when they got a little bit older, that was when it got hard. And I do hear that story, but the vast majority of the stories I hear, even people who had a pretty good childhood at the level of circumstance, have had a better life as adult survivors of childhood rather than, kind of in the midst of it. And likewise, adult survivors of, their early 20s, because the brain is still really developing then. And just imagining if you see the meme or any of those other things like it that suggests that, it's all downhill from here, or you should be grateful now because it's going to be worse in the future, that those are pretty toxic ideas that actually have us having less peace now and don't give us reliable information about the future. So they're not particularly accurate. Now, granted, the caveat for this, and I want to say this again in a more clear way, is if you're having something happening in your life that definitely puts you on a downward spiral, like if you have severe alcoholism, it's putting your job and relationships at risk, and you don't have a handle on that, then there is a downward spiral. If you've got a gambling habit and you're going into deeper and deeper debt, there's a downward spiral. But it still doesn't mean that 20 years from now you won't be so relieved because you've found your way out of these downward spirals into an upward spiral and life is way better at the level of circumstance. So a lot of this, does have a premise that if there's authentically something that is going to be a major problem that you have choice about, you may want to, deal with the fundamentals. You want to be able to pay your rent, but you also want to set yourself up as best you can on a destiny path for, being financially okay enough in the future. And so I just wanted to offer this because, I've seen this making the rounds, and it's not the meme itself. Again, I know that the people who are sharing it are coming from a good place of saying, maybe your problems aren't as big as they are. Maybe there's a lot to be grateful for. Maybe there are things that are really beautiful about your life. And if you consider this perspective, if you want to play that game with the meme, you could, look at a younger, more stressed version of yourself and say, look how thrilled 22-year-old Katie would have been to be dealing with, 49-year-old Katie's problems instead of 22-year-old Katie's problems. Like, if you really want to play that game, play it with your past self that has survived things and gotten to the place you are. But let's all vision that we're taking right action now, even if it's to get healthier so that we have more self-efficacy, so that we can, pull ourselves out the door by our ear, for a 20-minute walk 3 times a week or whatever the equivalent is, so that we, balance our mood in the present, support our brain health, support our mobility, and set future us up to really, really thrive in the world. There's so much, I think, that is cool and powerful about later in life that our society erases. And so I invite you to go look for those stories, and I invite you to craft an authentic narrative of, what you're setting future you up to experience that could be really cool and amazing and maybe beyond anything that you could imagine now. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.